Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. Trust you enjoyed the many parallel sessions running through the day. A couple of morning and afternoon tea breaks as well. We've now got two presentations to get us up to the end of day one here at AusCERT2021. Please keep those social media postings going. Great to see some of the stuff that people are sharing. In a tribute to the new normal, we're now about to take a speaker zooming in from the other side of the world before our Ask Me Anything session with Troy Hunt for both of these, and in particular the one for Troy. If you've got any questions you want to ask, please hit the Q&A icon in the app. This speaker, the founding CEO of the National Cybersecurity Centre and now a professor at the University of Oxford. Now, of course, the National Cybersecurity Centre, you don't need me to tell you, was the UK's world-leading institute, headed for the first 4 years by this gentleman who now holds a position of Professor of Practice in the Management of Public Organisations at Oxford University's Blavatnik School of Government, and advises NATO and a number of private sector organisations on cyber strategies. I'm hoping that we're about to see on a big screen behind me. Give a round of applause, please, for Professor Ciaran Martin. All yours, Ciaran. Take it away.
I'm there. Excellent. Well, I'm really sorry I'm not there in person. It's not entirely my fault. If we just leave the slides down for the moment, if that's all right, I think we'll call them up in about 10 minutes or so. Well, it's fantastic to be here virtually. I hope to be back in person. I want to start with one word of congratulations and 2 words of thanks. My first word of congratulations is to AusCERT, an organisation ahead of its time, on your 20th anniversary conference. I know you've been going for longer than that, but crucial work that I've long admired with the business community, with higher education, and with local government. And secondly, 2 words of thanks. One is to the next speaker. I think I'm pleased that I'm going before him because he's amazing. But Troy Hunt is a global cybersecurity treasure. As a teacher now at a university who teaches cybersecurity, all I really have to do is tell students, including world leaders, students in executive education programs, to type in their email to have I been pwned, and then suddenly I've got their attention. And the other, genuinely, is to Australians, particularly those in government, in government service at the ASD and the Australian Cybersecurity Centre, but many other partners as well. I had no better partner. I ran UK cybersecurity for 6.5 years, 2.5 setting up the National Cybersecurity Centre, the other 4 running it, and it was brilliant as part of the Five Eyes, learning so much from Australia's expertise and energy. We had our moments. I think the UK and Australia are designed to have sometimes a combustible relationship through time zones. Somebody's going to be grumpy because it's too early or it's too late or somebody's flown a long way, but we couldn't have any better partner. So in the next 25 minutes or so, I'm just going to take you through the theme of what is an organisation that doesn't exist to do cybersecurity supposed to do about it? How do we cope with all the fear and all the doubt and the growing but manageable threat when we want to be doing something else? We want to be running healthcare, we want to be running businesses, we want to be running schools, we just want to be living our lives in the way we are, and we can't afford always either the time or the money just to make our organizations about cybersecurity at a time when there's so much concern about cyber harm around. I mean, look where we are at the minute. I doubt, I haven't been, obviously because it's 7 in the morning here, I haven't been at the rest of the conference, but I suspect the Colonial Pipeline case has come up. Look where we are now in the United States. We have official government advice in force today asking people not to panic buy gasoline or petrol, as we call it over here, and put it in plastic bags. So if you wanted an illustration of the impact of cyber harms, it would be hard to think of a better one. And in a sense, this feeds all those warnings over years, over decades about really difficult cyber impacts, cyber wars, cybergeddon, and all the rest of it. The fact that there are these unstoppable, what my technical director of the National Cybersecurity Centre called winged cyber ninja monkeys, who were just sitting there in bedrooms in suburban England, suburban Australia, teenagers, unstoppable, hacking everything, and there was nothing we could do to stop them. And in a sense, the panic on the East Coast of the US at the moment seems to be fueling that narrative, except it's wrong. It's absolutely wrong. Let's take a look at what's actually happening in that case. We have a bunch of criminals, they're in over their heads, operating out of Russia. They've even issued a partial apology for what they've done, because what they were trying to do, yet again, is exploit basic weaknesses in corporate security all over the world to make money. And they've gone too far, because what they didn't realize was that by hacking the IT system of a pipeline company, that would then cause the company, for whatever reason, to shut down the pipeline. So you have yet again an accidental spiraling out of control, just as we've had in the past. I'll come to this, where a series of structural weaknesses in the way we do cybersecurity and the way the market's structured, the way our organizations are incentivized, has led to a public impact, which is very, very serious. That's the bad news. The good news is, when you look at the details of this and other cases, there are things we can do about it. We need absolutely to demystify cybersecurity. We have to treat it as an ordinary business risk. So in a sense, what I want to get across today is that any organization, however big or small, whatever it does, has got a bunch of risks that it needs to manage. The key messages I've got for you today are: cyber threats, cyber risks, they're not catastrophes. Cyber harms are the aggregation of small harms. Hype, fear, uncertainty, doubt, that is our enemy. What we need to do instead is understand the who, the why, the what, and the hows of cybersecurity. We need to identify the risk in each organization and manage it accordingly. It will differ between risks, between organizations. And finally, smaller organizations, any organizations can do this. So if we could just call up the first slide and just put it through. What I've done here is, because in my time in government, I was so frustrated with the whole fear, uncertainty, and doubt of cybersecurity. I don't know if we're getting the slides up. I can't see. Because I was so annoyed with the fear, uncertainty, and doubt of cybersecurity, as soon as I left, what I did was I drew up a chart of harm. And this wasn't scientific. This wasn't meant to be saying this is all the harm in cybersecurity. I was saying, in 6.5 years running cybersecurity for a major economy, this is what I saw. And it's absolutely based on the reality of everyday cybersecurity. So I don't know if you can see a 9-box grid, a taxonomy of cyber cyber harm. What you will see in the bottom right is catastrophic cyber harm. And by that, and there's an asterisk beside that, and that's because that is the one thing that has not happened. There have been all sorts of cyber attacks. There have been many, many of them. And the one thing that we can still say, thankfully, is that the official death toll caused by cyber harms is 0. There was a very sad case in Germany last year where a patient on her way to hospital had to be diverted to a different hospital because of a ransomware attack, but the German authorities couldn't causally link to criminal justice standards the death of this patient to this cyber attack. So what we haven't had is the catastrophic sort of attack. What we've had instead is this whole spate of categories of harm caused, and these are the ones that I saw in my time in government. So what have we seen instead? We've seen 3 categories of harm. I call them getting robbed, getting weakened, and getting hurt. I'll just walk you through them quickly, pausing on some of them, and then we'll walk through some case studies, because these are the sorts of things that happen to real organizations all the time. People get cash stolen from them. Everyone's after cash if they can get it. That can range from, the first incident I dealt with as head of the National Cybersecurity Centre was an attempt to brute force attack our national lottery here in the UK in order to get some cash. Thankfully, we managed to stop the attack. I'd like to be able to say they didn't get away with any money. They actually got away with £13.50. So in one respect, we failed. On the other hand, given that cybersecurity is about the reduction of harm, I'm reasonably happy with that. At the other end of the scale, some North Korean hackers in 2016 hacked the Bank of Bangladesh through the endpoint of the SWIFT interbank clearance system. They made off with $81 million, and had it not been for a mistake in the English language, which alerted regulators in New York, it would have been 850 million. You get into the more sophisticated getting robbed. You get into IP theft. The Chinese state, as we'll see in a minute, voraciously seeks the intellectual property of other countries as part of its getting rich strategy. You get into data theft at an industrial scale. We need to understand the different gradations of data theft, because there's a huge criminal underworld that sells and monetizes this data, so it can match my email, all the stuff on have I been pwned and so forth, with other data sets, and seemingly innocuous data sets in that way can become valuable. But sometimes data theft is so significant it becomes strategically important, and that gets into getting weakened. So you look at in getting weakened, this is where societies as a whole, as opposed to individuals losing bits of money or valuable property or data, societies as a whole get weakened by strategic attacks. So on espionage, one of the most strategically impactful hacks of all time was against the United States in 2015, where the Chinese are believed to have stolen the entire federal government database of everyone who applied for a US federal government security clearance this century, 21.5 million people. And if you've ever filled out a government security clearance form, and I have, you will know it's not just your name and email address and maybe a password and the last 4 digits of a bank card. It's absolutely everything about you. How did they do that? They did some social engineering. They found the systems administrator, presumably on LinkedIn, cultivated that person, guessed some passwords, and then spent more than 24 hours copying the database without the organization noticing this massive use of computing power. So you can see all sorts of red flags here. This wasn't an irresistible attack. This is something where there are various times you can stop it. But look at the strategic harm that will do to the US, the chilling effect it will have on its public servants, knowing that a potentially hostile state has this data. And you see how people can get weakened. We have seen societies undermined in the West by interference in elections through fairly basic cyber attacks. And I know, given the important role that local government plays in AusCERT and the important role that local government plays in electoral administration, that's of huge interest. But of course, these are small organizations that need to know how to protect themselves. We see pre-positioning. That's when states just menacingly put down intrusions into energy companies, telecoms companies. Why are they there? We don't know, but it's a useful bridgehead if there's a time of tension. So you go from getting robbed, you go from getting weakened, and then there are times where societies get hurt. They suffer disruptive damage in destructive attacks. Many of these, like colonial pipelines, are seemingly accidental. In the summer of 2017, in fact, 4 years ago today, towards the end of the week, I was traveling home, got called to go back to London because our hospital booking systems weren't working. Why? Seemingly they were being extorted by unknown actors. I remember thinking, why is anyone trying to extort the British National Health Service? It's the one organization that famously is frequently short of money and isn't allowed, and it's one of the most scrutinized organizations in the world. It turns out it was the North Koreans trying to steal more money, as they'd done from Bangladesh, the Bank of Bangladesh, but their ransomware attack had gone out of control. It had gone viral. and had disrupted not just the booking systems in the British National Health Service, but had taken out the notifications at German railway platforms. The following month, the Russians attacked a professional services firm in Ukraine and ended up disrupting, and I'm not making this up, you can check it, given it's close, given it's in Oman, disrupting production for a while at a chocolate factory in Tasmania, which I'm sure was not central to the Russia-Ukraine tensions. So these destructive attacks happen, and they're often linked to the scourge of ransomware. So let's just look at this in the round. What do we have? This is the reality of cyber harms. It's not glamorous. It's not individual catastrophes. It's all sorts of nebulous, pernicious, nasty little incidents exploiting basic weaknesses to add up to a big, big social problem. So that's the what's happening. Let's have a look at the next slide very quickly at who's doing it. Well, if you're a Western country like us, we face 4 nation-state attackers. And it's easy to put the flags up there of China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, but they all are very different. I'm not telling you this just because I think it's interesting, although I hope it is. It's because we need to think about how to manage risk. And to manage risk, you need to think about who might be attacking you. So let's take China and Russia, 2 very often malevolent actors on the global internet, but they have very different motivations. So the history of China's cyber attack capability has been primarily, not exclusively, but primarily economic. Get rich quick, rapid economic development, so steal other people's IP. Of course, global espionage is also of interest to them. And increasingly, as we've seen with all the debates about supply chains and so forth, increasingly China is moving beyond cyber intrusions and towards actual technological dominance of tech markets, which is a different problem. So that's the way you think about China. Have I got something valuable? Am I strategically important in terms of intellectual property? Or even, will a Chinese state-backed company want to buy me up because I'm strategically important? Russia's different. Russia is trying to gain traditional geopolitical advantage, so it's much more interested in political interference, it's much more interested in, for example, Russian dissidents abroad. It's much more interested in intrusions into strategically important sectors like energy and so forth. And so, for example, if you're a big global law firm and you're looking at the states, managing the state's threats from China and Russia, you say, well, I've lots of mergers and acquisitions and intellectual property. Well, that's what China will be interested in. But I don't have any Russian oligarchs who have tensions with President Putin on my books. Well, if you do, Russia will be interested in that. And that's a different way of defending. So we need to work out understanding what you've got and what a state actor might be interested in. Iran and North Korea have both got rudimentary capabilities, but high risk appetites. So there are numerous examples of organizations or countries annoying the Iranians and then retaliating with cyber intrusions, including destructive ones like DDoS attacks on American banks or attacks on Saudi oil companies, which go beyond what they'd be prepared to do in the physical world. Similarly with North Korea, who famously hacked Sony and embarrassed George Clooney and other celebrities, but also caused real problems to the company, but are now actually become the world's first, in the words of the US Department of Justice, state-sponsored cyber criminal, because they're desperate for money. So they're trying to disrupt financial systems in Australia, in the UK, and everywhere else. So those are the state attackers. There are others who are trying to get into that. But the biggest threat to everyone is on the next slide, which is international organized cybercrime. And the Colonial Pipeline intrusion has shown this to be, has shown the way this worked. This is a service. These are not terribly sophisticated technically, although they're not bad, but they're well organized. And they're not single monolithic beasts. They pay other people. They pay, in this slide, they pay data miners, intrusion specialists, money launderers, people who've nothing to do with cybersecurity. Now, what you don't have on this slide are terrorist groups. They haven't developed cyber capabilities. You don't have all powerful hackers sitting in their bedrooms. What you have basically is two sets of things. You have state attackers and you have criminals who are causing all of this problem. And again, they're doing it through largely basic exploitation. So if you look at the next slide with one of the examples, this is one of the most impactful economic espionage cases of all time. So you look at the top, wanted by the FBI, in the top 10 at the time, very sort of glamorous, a hack by the Chinese into the managed service providers, the IT services company on whom most of the Western world's IT services depend. The FBI director, Christopher Wray, called this the A to Z of American business were among the victims. It was a huge global campaign of corporate espionage. The damage is incalculable and worthy of an FBI poster. But let's look how it was done. In the bottom left, you've got the Melissa virus. It's from the year 2000. And the way that this intrusion started in Japan, it may not have been the start of the whole intrusion, was that some Word attachments running macros with the Melissa virus in them were sent and opened by some Japanese business executives. It's not their fault. Any modern version of Windows would have stopped it, but it wasn't there. And then on the right, we've got the Quasar remote access Trojan, which sounds very glamorous, but you can buy that off the internet. You can buy that for £700 or US dollars. You can get a training manual for it, but it was able to roam across from Japan on unsegmented networks freely for months undetected. So a very, very strategically impactful hack but worked off very, very basic capabilities. Similarly, on the next slide, two big intrusions into US and British politics, the US one being much bigger and much more famous against Secretary Clinton in 2016. Below Secretary Clinton is one of her aides, John Podesta, and the way the Russians did that, firstly, they hacked into the server of the Democratic National Committee. That's a small organization. And then they hacked into the Gmail of Mr. Podesta, and then they just did a data dump. Similarly, in the 2019 general election, these are two British politicians, Liam Fox, a Conservative trade minister at the time, and Jeremy Corbyn, then the leader of the Labour Party. And someone in Dr. Fox's department sent an email to a Gmail so that they could work on it offline because they didn't like this safe remote working stuff. And that ended up being a very controversial election leak where documents about the relationship between the alleged privatization of healthcare and post-Brexit trade deals became a big talking point. So very, very basic security lapses leading to quite high impact stuff. In the next slide, we see some of the interesting points about critical infrastructure. And we're going to be talking about this more and more after the pipeline. And here I think we have to think about getting security right as well as safety. English is a very interesting language because it's got separate words for security and safety. Most European languages have the same words, seguridad in Spanish, security in French, and so forth. And we're actually quite good at safety. So look at colonial pipelines. Everything's been switched off safely. Just because of insecurity, major disruptions happening. But if you look at the left, this is this fascinating case from only January this year in a small town called Oldsmar in Florida, where somebody believed to be a disgruntled employee actually hacked into the remote working facility for a water treatment plant in the city of Oldsmar, Florida, and somehow managed to use that compromise to start changing the chemical composition of the drinking water. So this is disastrous that can happen. The good news is that there were multiple checks on the water going out, pH checks, other checks, so it didn't come close to affecting anybody. And that's an example of bad practice in the first instance. The water should never have allowed to have been altered through remote access, but good practice in there's that resilience, that non-cyber resilience, which gets us through. And that is why, if you look at the book title on the right about Click Here to Kill Everybody, we're actually containing some of the cyber threats into disruption rather than real harm. So in understanding these harms and understanding how our systems work and the relationship between cyber and non-cyber, we get to the positive stories, which is the last sort of war story. If you go to the next slide, about how we can try to contain this. So everyone's talking about ransomware, and it's a disaster, and it is, and we need to do more. But let's be optimistic. There's some really, really good examples of good practice here. So this is a Polish company called Project Red. They got ransomware, but they had good backups. They had a good incident response plan. So what they did was they kept going, and they announced they'd been ransomwared. They announced they weren't going to pay it. They wrote to their customers saying, look, apologies if these criminals leak the data, but we will do everything we can to contain the harm. And they published the technical details of the attack so that security researchers could have a go at these people. So it's not all bad, and it's not all doom and gloom. We need to think about protections, and we need to think about getting protections right. So I'm going to give you a quick example before we finish about how to get protections wrong and then right. So if we look at the next slide, so much of this and so much of what we've been talking about has been about passwords. Has been about basics and basic accesses, and one of those things has been about password compromises. It's come up at various points, including in the Chinese attack on the American database. So here's some mathematical approximations about how to compromise a password. So if you have something very basic, just a few letters, it can be done instantly by a hacker. Then if you do something very sophisticated, as in the bottom right, where you've got special characters, letters, numbers, uppercase, lowercase, it will take you sort of 8 quadrillion years. So everybody goes, great, we're going to have long, complex passwords. Unfortunately, when you have to have separate ones for every account, then and they all have to meet that that sort of gold standard criteria. What happens is the next slide, and in the next slide, that is 600 digits. And at the UK, sorry, just go to the previous one, just the 600 digits. At the previous slide, at my previous job at the National Cybersecurity Centre, we got a professor of psychology to compute what we were asking the average person to do with passwords. And she came back and said, we're asking people to do the mental equivalent of learning a new 600-digit number every month. It's crazy, and people can't do it. So by looking at, to narrow an aspect of the problem, what makes for a strong password, we were asking people to do the impossible. When people are asked to do the impossible, they take shortcuts. When people take shortcuts, hacks happen. So look instead, and if we go to the next slide, this is now what the National Cybersecurity Centre in the UK, backed by Australia, and it's similar in Australia, it's similar in the US now, is saying, use sensible password policy, use password managers. Organizations should allow people to paste passwords into websites through password managers, because that is sensible risk management, and have one master password that you can sensibly learn and protect, because that is the keys to the kingdom. This is why, just as I begin to conclude, the overall approach, if we go to the next slide, has to be one of risk management. So home working. Don't just tell people that when they work from home, they have to make sure they don't click on links. Give them good equipment, give them VPNs, make sure they know bring your own device and all the rest of it, so you don't have crazy outcomes such as the one in the water plant. And an aggregate, if we go to the next slide, which is crucial, I'll probably finish on this, manage risk well at organizational level. Board leaderships, whether that's a charity, a university, a local government, national government, small business, big business, boards need to understand a little bit about cybersecurity now. They need to get a little bit technical. They need to know the sort of hacks that happen, as in that 9-box grid that I showed earlier, and they need to be able to have an informed conversation about that. I used to, when I was in government, I used to enjoy teasing oil company executives when they'd say, the cybersecurity stuff, it's very scary and I don't really understand it. I'd say to them, you can extract fossil fuels from the seabed safely and economically and get them transported, although not this week in America, get them transported to consumers and businesses all over the world. You can manage enormously complicated health and safety risks. You can manage enormously complicated financial risks. But if I mention computer network security to you, you say it's too complicated. You wouldn't have a board member sitting out a discussion on pension liability saying, well, I'm afraid I have nothing to say here. I don't really understand that. The same has to be true at cybersecurity. And so in this is a summary of the National Cybersecurity Centre's board toolkit, which is the sort of conversation organizations need to be having. It hasn't been, oh, have we done a cybersecurity risk assessment? Oh, good, an expensive company has done that for us. It's conversations like this. Assuming that somebody's going to click on a dodgy link, because we can't expect people who are busy with other things to spot everything, how are we going to manage the fact that people get into our network? How are we going to manage not being the next Colonial Pipeline? How are we going to notice this? How are we going to notice this intrusion? It's stuff like that. It's who is our systems administrator? What is, how big is their team? And how are we protecting those people who are more important strategically in cybersecurity than the chief executive or the chair? So I would encourage people, have a look at the Australian government's guidance, the British government's guidance, is all freely available, and just manage risk well enough. You don't need to have nation state defenses. So we just lose the slides for the last minute or two. It's very easy to be terrified of cybersecurity. It's very easy to be infantilized by cyber risks and the hype around cybersecurity. But there are good news stories. Firstly, no one is asking small organizations, universities, local government, no one's asking them to be able to take on the best of a hostile nation state, the best of the Chinese state on their own. If you get targeted, and not many do, but some do, by one of those elite actors, then you're entitled to government help. That's what national security is about. So for example, where I now work in the University of Oxford, a small research institute called the Jenner Institute suddenly became the center of world attention because it turned out it got quite a few good people who were excellent at making cheap coronavirus vaccines. And that became the subject of the world's attention, including the attention of some of the most hostile actors. So the UK government helped that organization protect itself because it was too small to do it. And it's a small medical research facility, not a cybersecurity facility. But the final story, because I've given you all these stories of things going wrong, I would like to pay tribute to our American friends in what they did to protect the election of 2020 from outside cyber interference. Look at the legacy of 2016, how toxic that proved. And look what they did in 2020. They got the state and local governments together. They got all the major agencies together. They got all the businesses together. And it meant that tiny organizations in rural states like Nebraska and the Dakotas and so forth actually knew how to manage cyber risk effectively, knew how their systems work, knew how resilient to be and how to achieve that resilience, knew how to share that information. And they did that through a well-informed partnership between government, federal government, local government, businesses, NGOs, and so forth. And the sort of partnerships that AusCERT have been fomenting over the last 20 years are ideally suited to meet these challenges. So understand the harms, have a risk-based approach, a realistic approach, and work with partners, and we can get on top of this problem. Thank you very much for listening to me this afternoon, and enjoy the rest of this great event.
Professor Ciaran Martin, thank you so much for that. Ciaran, can I just ask you one quick question? And I ask this as a conference MC who's a bit of an outsider to this space, but I hear about the big events you're talking about of recent times, there seem to have been 4 or 5 really high-profile hack events recently. But then again, you take us back to 2015 for that massive case of cyber espionage. So is it a particularly hot patch at the moment, or is this just business as usual?
We've had a number of reminders. We've had a big spying intrusion in the US from the so-called SolarWinds case, and another one from Chinese on Microsoft again in the US. We've had the water plant incident, and now we've had the Colonial Pipelines disruption. The good news for people like us is that they're all in the United States. It reminds me of when I sent my deputy to a conference. I don't think it was AusCERT, but I sent him to a conference in Australia, and he was saying the same thing. This is before lockdown. He was saying the same thing as I was saying about you need to manage risk, be good enough. You don't have to see off every attack. And he said, my job is not to send, is not to stop all cybercrime. It's to send it to France. Unfortunately, this being the global internet age, this got back to my French counterpart. Is it getting worse? I think it's actually steady, but I think we're becoming more aware of the impact. And I think it's variable. So I think that the lesson of the last while, the lesson of the last 6 months is that it's glaringly exposed to a much bigger audience, the fundamental weaknesses in things like supply chains. Why is one company, which turns out was its updates were poisoned by Russian state actors. Why is one company supplying half of the most important federal government in the world without checks on supply chains? And that's why President Biden issued an executive order trying to solve that problem last night. So I think what we've had are a series of more visible exposures of long existing problems. So don't despair. There's stuff we can do.
Fantastic. Please give Professor Ciaran Martin another big round of applause. Thank you so much for presenting live into our
Thanks,
time
everybody.
today. Ciaran Martin, there you go. What a wonderful presentation that was.